11 years ago, I was wearing traditional Bavarian Lederhosen, drinking a liter of beer on a hot summer day in Munich after having just moved to Germany. And my husband and our friend were there with me at the summer festival, and they dared me to roll down a hill as a joke. And at first, my reaction was absolutely not, because why would I do that? I'm an adult, I'm wearing traditional Bavarian clothes, people are going to look at me. And then they just looked at me and said, well, why not? And I couldn't give them a real answer because the only answer I had was that someone might see me and think I look ridiculous. That was the entire barrier between me and this very stupid, very harmless little moment of joy. So I gathered up the courage and eventually I did it. I rolled down that hill in my lederhosen, and when I sat back up, nothing had really happened. Nobody shouted or pointed or turned it into a thing. And I remember just realizing something that I had been feeling ever since I came to Germany, but really hadn't had the words for it yet. No one cared. And for me, at that point in my life, that felt like freedom. Now, let me rewind for a second. The first time I ever visited Germany was in 2012. I went to Hamburg, Berlin, Munich, Nuremberg, and Regensburg. And yes, that trip to Munich is also when I met my now husband and had what I can only describe as a love at first sight moment, which then basically changed the entire direction of my life and is the reason why I'm sitting here today, but that's a whole different story. But one of the places that I first went on that trip was this summer festival in Munich called Tollwood. It's a bit more international, a bit more kind of like alternative, really a lot of fun. And this is important because Tollwood was actually where I first noticed this feeling before I ever had language for it. And we were sitting on this grassy hill. This was in 2012, overlooking the festival. And around us were just completely different groups of people. You had like alternative metal looking people, families with children playing, and there were like college age guys, random older people there as well, and everyone just kind of like sitting there in their own little world. And what struck me was that not everybody was the same. It was the opposite. Everyone seemed different, but nobody seemed especially disturbed by that. Someone could, I don't know, look a little strange or act a little silly with their friends, just visibly be themselves, and it didn't immediately become someone else's business. And that was one of the first things that I noticed in Germany. People seemed less bothered by other people. And I don't mean that in a cold way. I know that Germans get that reputation sometimes. And there is this truth to the fact that people here can, of course, be more reserved. But I mean that actually in the most liberating way possible. People were just out in the world, looking how they look, dressing how they dress, being who they were, and strangers didn't seem to react much. And I get like we were at a festival, people are maybe just more accepting of everyone that was there, but then I, started to see that in the subway, in cafes, in the city. I saw more men with long hair. I saw people wearing more visible tattoos. I saw people wearing traditional Bavarian clothes like it was completely normal because in that context it was. And of course, like at the end of the day, most people look normal, like very pedestrian. This is true everywhere. This was almost 15 years ago at this point, so I'm not pretending that my first impression in 2012 is some fixed sociological truth about all of Germany today. But coming from where I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, in the US, where a lot of men dressed like they were either going golfing or going to church or something. And then even after living in New York City, which by the way is much more normal looking in everyday life than TV makes it to seem. And most people just wearing, I don't know, jeans and a t-shirt. But Germany felt different to me. It felt like people had a little more room just to be themselves without everyone else around reacting to it. And I remember my friend that was traveling with me during the time, he's really into sort of like Viking stuff, has tattoos, has longer hair, and he's been to Germany a few times and he's like, I always feel less judged in Germany than the US. And I get that because like at the same time, I didn't fully know what to do with that sentence, but I felt it too when I was in Germany. So that was in 2012. I noticed at first as a visitor Then 3 years later, I had moved to Munich and was living there. Martin, my now husband, and I, we had just moved in together. And this festival, Tollwood, was only a 5-minute walk away from our apartment. So we went back there my first week living in Germany. And yeah, I really liked going. So it was like kind of a thing. And it was becoming more of like my actual life in Germany, going to festivals. And we went back to that hill where the beginning comes back in. And what mattered was this: I was like back in the same place where I had once watched other people exist so easily. And now I had to confront how difficult that was still for me. So when Martin and our friend dared me to roll down that hill, the actual thing was so harmless. It wasn't dangerous in any way. It wasn't offensive. It wasn't important in any real way. But I remember my body acted like it was. I got embarrassed before anything ever happened. And I don't know, like I could imagine being watched or imagine that I looked stupid. I could feel people already making some sort of comment. And that was the part that stayed with me. Because back then I had observed something here. I had watched other people just exist without apologizing for it. And then a few days later, I had to participate in it. And the gap between those two things, between noticing that freedom in other people and actually being able to feel it yourself, that gap was bigger than I expected. And eventually I did this small, silly thing. And when I looked around afterwards, nobody had made it my problem. Maybe, of course, someone saw it and thought something internally. Probably people have thoughts. But no one turned their reaction into something I had to deal with. And that distinction matters. Because I think in the US, at least in the environments that I grew up in, people would be much more likely to comment. Of course, not in some kind of cruel way, sometimes of course, and like probably in a joking way, but there was often this feeling that your behavior was available for other people to react to. And in Germany, at least in that moment, it felt like the social contract was different. You do your thing, I do mine. And as long as nobody is hurting anybody, we can just keep living. There's actually a cultural data point that makes this interesting, though I'd like to take it as an imperfect lens, not as proof of anything. But the US scores higher on individualism than Germany. So on paper, America is the more individualistic culture. But what I started to feel in Germany was that there are different kinds of individualism. The kind that I grew up around in the US often felt connected to achievement, self-expression, proving yourself, becoming someone. And what I felt in Germany was quieter. It was less about standing out and more about being left alone. And I know that sounds less glamorous, but honestly, for someone like me, tolerance felt way more freeing than attention. And then this started showing up in other parts of life. I started going to German saunas. If you don't know this, German saunas are usually naked, not just wear whatever makes you feel comfortable or swimsuits optional. Naked is mandatory for hygienic reasons, they say. So you have men, women, different ages, different body types, sitting in the same space, sweating, cooling down, drinking water, minding their business. And the first time you hear that as an American, especially if you grew up in a more conservative or religious environment, it sounds almost impossible to imagine. Because where I come from and how I was raised, nudity is almost never just neutral. It quickly becomes sexualized or embarrassing or something people feel like they have to hide. And then you go into a German sauna and somehow it's like the least dramatic thing in the world. People are naked and nobody is making it weird. That was honestly one of the most healing things I experienced here because I grew up religious. I went to a Christian private school. So there was definitely this strong sense that my body was something to manage, to cover, control, and sometimes feel ashamed of. And I think this is especially stronger for women who grow up in the church. But like also when you grow up gay in that kind of environment like I did, The shame is not only just about your body, it's also about your body giving something away. The way you move, the way you speak, the way you look at someone, the way someone might look at you. There was always this feeling that someone was watching, whether it was God, the church, community, classmates, or just the people around me. And sometimes the gaze was real, and sometimes it was something that I had just internalized. But either way, it followed me. And then I was in a sauna in Munich, completely naked, surrounded by other naked people. And somehow I felt less watched than I had in, I don't know, my school uniform or church clothes. And I know that sounds strange, but it's true. Because no one was scanning me for meaning or turning my body into some kind of statement about who I was. But this was just my body, and that was an incredible feeling. There are also other places in Munich where public nudity is part of the culture. There's this area in the English Garden where people sunbathe naked. It's only 15 minutes away from the city center, so I think a lot of tourists are a bit confused when they go into the English Garden. And then there's this place called the Flaucher by the river Isar that's known for that too, where people like barbecue, and it's kind of like a beach. And during my first summer in Munich, I would go to the Flaucher to do my German homework because it was so hot and I didn't have air conditioning like most people here. And it was just one of the few places that I could be outside that felt bearable. And there were people of all genders, all ages, really all body types. Some clothed, some not. And very quickly I caught onto the rhythm of it. This was not about being looked at, it was really almost the opposite. It was about not having to turn the body into a thing. So there's a word for this tradition, it's called Freikörperkultur, usually shortened to FKK or FKK in English, which means free body culture. And from what I understand, it has roots in Germany going back to the late 19th century, connected to those ideas at the time around health, nature, sunlight, air, and freedom from overly restricted social norms, especially after everything that happened in history up until that point. So it's not just Germans are chill about being naked, there's like this whole cultural history behind it. And for me, it helped loosen something that had been very tightly wound. It didn't happen all at once, but little by little, those little ideas about purity, shame, and being watched started to lose some of their power. Germany didn't, of course, magically heal everything in me, but there were environments here where the old shame just had less room to grow. Another place where I felt this was in beer gardens and beer festivals, especially Bavaria. And I do need to be careful here because people watching from, I don't know, Hamburg, Berlin, or Cologne will probably tell you that Bavaria is its own planet, and they are not wrong. Bavaria has its own traditions, its own public rituals, its own relationships to beer gardens and traditional clothing, and sitting together on beer benches. So I'm not saying every part of Germany feels exactly like Munich, but underneath the Bavarian version of it, I did notice something that I have also felt in quieter ways, also in other parts of Germany. There's often the sense of we don't have to be the same to share space. In a crowded beer tent or beer garden, if there are no free tables, you kind of walk around and ask if you can sit down next to people. So strangers from completely different backgrounds, different countries, ages, political views, what have you, can end up sitting at the same table, drinking a beer, eating food, talking or not talking, depends. It's not always some kind of magical version of community. Sometimes it's, of course, awkward, people might be more reserved. Sometimes nobody says much, or on the flip side, you become best friends. I don't know. But the basic idea is still powerful to me. You do not need to be fully understood by everyone around you to belong in the space. You can just sit down and have your beer. And for someone who spent a lot of life feeling like I had to calculate how much of myself was acceptable in a room, that mattered. Another place where this difference shows up is how people talk about politics. In Germany, it's much more normal to talk about politics in everyday settings. At a housewarming party, at dinner, with colleagues, with friends, people can disagree pretty directly and still keep sitting together. That does not mean that Germany is some perfect land of civil discourse. It is not. Things have become here also more polarized too. And there are obviously political views that I personally find dangerous, especially as a gay father raising a child in a diverse family. But compared to the US, I have often felt that disagreement here does not automatically become identity warfare in the same way. In the US, politics and religion can be treated as things you should never bring up with strangers. It's very taboo. And at the same time, politics and religion are everywhere and shaping everything, just often without being openly discussed. In Germany, I have more conversations where people can say, I disagree with you, and then keep talking. And that maybe sounds small, but I think it connects to this bigger theme. I started to realize that freedom isn't just about saying whatever you want. It's also about disagreeing with someone and not immediately feeling like the whole relationship is at risk. And this is where the German system itself kind of gets interesting, because people often complain about German bureaucracy. And honestly, I understand why. The paperwork can be absurd. The digital infrastructure feels like someone who heard about the internet once in 2003 and decided that that was enough information. There are forms for forms, appointments for appointments, letters in the mail that you get that make you feel like you did something wrong, and actually they just want one document that they could have requested 6 months ago. So yes, the bureaucracy can be exhausting, but there's also a flip side. That same system, slow and rigid as it is part of what gives people a certain kind of freedom, whether that's parental leave, health insurance, legal protections, public systems that, at least in principle, make your entire life not collapse just because you get sick, have a child, lose a job, need to take time off to care for a family member. And as someone from the US, that matters. Because it's hard to feel free to roll down the hill if one hospital bill could destroy your life. It's hard to be free to be yourself if every part of survival depends on pleasing an employer, pleasing a church, a family system, pleasing people who have power over you. Germany has a lot of rules, and some of them are exhausting, but I started to see that some of those rules create a kind of floor underneath you, and for me, that floor has made it easier to breathe. And now, as one of two fathers raising your son here, I think about that in a different way, because freedom is no longer just about me, it's also the kind of environment our family gets to exist in. And I want to phrase this carefully because I'm not saying Germany is perfect for queer families. It's not. I've made videos on the subject. There are legal gaps, there are social blind spots, there are people who just do not understand surrogacy and will always be against it, or gay fathers, or rainbow families, or the way that our family specifically came to be. But in our everyday life so far, with our neighbors, healthcare professionals, government workers, people at the bakery, people on the street, like wherever, we've mostly been able to just be a family. People have treated us like we are, just a family, and that quietness matters a lot to me because I spent so many years feeling like being fully visible would cost me something. And here, more often than not, I have felt like I can be visible without constantly having to defend myself. Not always and everywhere, of course, but often enough that has changed something in me. So what does all of this actually add up to? Looking back, I think there are basically two ways that a society can make you feel free. One version basically says, stand out, prove yourself, become someone. And that's a version that I grew up around, and for a lot of people, it works. The other version is quieter. It says, exist, do your thing, I'll do mine. And what that second version gives you that the first one doesn't is the permission to be ordinary, to be weird, to be naked in a sauna, to roll down a hill in Lederhosen, to sit at a table with strangers who vote differently than you and still finish your beer. And it's not about everyone celebrating you. It's more that nobody is making you their business. And I think that distinction matters more than we usually talk about. Because so much of the hiding that people do, the shrinking, the editing, the calculating, it does not come from one dramatic moment of rejection. It comes from thousands of small signals over years that tell you someone is watching, someone will always comment, someone will always make this about them. And honestly, once you are somewhere where that pressure is quieter, you start to realize how much noise there was before. This is our one life. And I know that can sound like something you put on a coffee mug, but I mean that in a very real way. We get one life as far as I know, and at some point, I had to ask myself how much of that life I was willing to shrink just so that strangers, classmates, religious people, random people on a train, people from my past, or people in my own head would not judge me. Because the truth is, the stranger who might think I look ridiculous is also going to forget me. Maybe in 3 minutes, maybe in 3 hours, maybe 3 years, I don't know, but definitely eventually. And I don't mean that in a nihilistic way. I actually find it comforting. Most people are busy living their own lives. They're thinking about their own problems, their own insecurities, their own groceries, relationships, their own emails, their own weird childhood wounds. And once you really feel that, it becomes harder to give them so much power. Of course, I still think what people think sometimes. I'm human. That instinct does not just disappear because you move countries and go to a German sauna. There are still moments where I catch myself doing it again, but the difference is now that I can notice it. I can say, oh, there's that old gaze again. That is the part of me that learned very early on to survive by hiding. And then I can choose something else. From growing up in a conservative environment in Georgia to going to a private Christian school, then moving to New York and opening up parts of myself, to living in Germany and slowly realizing that I don't have to turn myself into a smaller, safer, easier version of who I am. This has been one of the biggest transformations of my life. I don't think Germany magically made me feel free, but it did give me a place where I could start practicing that feeling in small ways, like rolling down a hill in Lederhosen, like sitting naked in a sauna and realizing nobody is judging me or my body, like talking about politics at the dinner table and surviving the disagreement, like walking through our neighborhood as two dads or their son and feeling like we can just be. And for me, freedom doesn't feel or mean that everyone celebrates me or understands every part of my life. It just means that I don't have to hide all the time. So I'm curious, have you ever lived somewhere, traveled somewhere, or entered a new environment where you suddenly felt like you didn't have to hide as much anymore? What was the first thing you did that made you feel that? And if you live in Germany, I'd really like to know whether this resonates with you or whether your experience feels completely different, especially if you're outside of Bavaria. Thanks so much for watching. If this video resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe if you want more reflections on life in Germany, fatherhood, culture, and building a family in our own way. See you next time.